Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the reading of the fic entitled When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This is the third fic in the Frequently Asked Questions series, so if you haven't listened to the first two, I would recommend those, or if you haven't at least read those fics, highly recommend. Here's the summary. Frequently asked questions don't always have the same answer, not when it's the whole world being questioned. But Midoriya had never let that stop him from asking, even in the face of hate and ridicule. One of his questions had been answered, but that didn't mean he didn't have more. This fic is 8 chapters long with just over 85,000 words. Here's Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The world changes, if only in small increments. Shota's eyes burned. He had chronic dry eye, so it wasn't an unfamiliar feeling, but most days they were made worse by extended quirk usage. Today they burned with the anger he felt. When he made it to the staff room door, he pushed down the urge to slam the door open. That would be irrational. He was angry and frustrated, sure, but that didn't give him an excuse to act like a teenager throwing a fit, trying to get someone to notice. So when he came through the door, it was with his usual low level of enthusiasm. "Hey, Shota! Running late and missing out on nap time. Must have had a pretty hectic day one." Hisaashi's greeting was met with an unimpressed glare, a warning to keep the volume down. "I just spent half an hour dealing with one of my students." He sensed the other teachers turning their attention to him as he made his way over to his desk, rummaging around his drawer for some eye drops. "I would appreciate it if you didn't blow out my eardrums." "Fair enough, man." Shota just rolled his eyes at Hisaashi as he began reviewing lesson plans based on what he had learned about his students today, while one particular student and his words ran through the back of his mind. Half an hour is a pretty long time to talk with one student. Nemuri wasn't directly addressing him, but she was definitely speaking loud enough to make sure she was heard. "Wouldn't happen to be from another Day 1 expulsion, would it?" Glancing up revealed an eager Nemuri leaning forward at her desk, staring at him intently. Usually, he would brush off the statement and let them figure it out for themselves, but right now he was frustrated. When he came across a problem, he liked to fix it. It was only logical to cut to the center of the matter and sort out the issue before things could get worse. However, when it came to Midoriya, he had no idea where to start. The kid obviously had issues if his reaction to encouragement was to break down, not to mention the unhealthy level of focus needed to get into a top hero school, without consciously realizing that you were attending said school. But there were too many variables to break down and work with. Nothing specific that Shota could work with to fix, except, "You're the only person who has ever said I could be a hero." Quirk discrimination was, unfortunately, a common occurrence. He knew that those who were different were punished for it, and in a society revolving around quirks, not having one would be a sure way to be left behind at every possible turn. Nemuri was still waiting for his answer, so he decided he would make the most of her attention, and by extension, the other teachers that were present at the moment. A lazy sweep over the room revealed that Inui was the only one who had gone back to his work, while Ishiyama and Takashi were pretending to do the same. Hisaashi was keeping to himself, headphones on, but he probably expected the full story when they got home. No doubt he would also complain about the logical ruse Shota was about to pull. But he had figured out the first thing he could do to sort out the Midoriya problem and wasn't about to hold back just to be polite. Actually, it was the quirkless student. Shota didn't say that he expelled Midoriya, but he didn't need to. They all assumed it, and with that assumption he'd be able to figure out how they viewed a quirkless student. This would give him a chance to make sure they didn't disregard the kid, didn't join what was probably a substantial list of people who ignored his potential because of his quirklessness. It does make sense that the quirkless kid was the one that ended up getting expelled. Takashi began, his permanent grin seemingly grim. "That's kinda sad, but an expulsion is an expulsion, so pay up, Ishiyama." The gray hero sighed as Nemuri leant over her desk to collect her winnings. "So you think I was justified?" The four of them, Hisaashi having joined them again after seeing Nemuri collect her bet, refocused their attention on Shota, who was now sitting forward and meeting their eyes individually. He stayed silent as they thought of their answers. They'd worked together long enough to know a weighted question when he asked one. Takashi was the first to speak up, the blank eyes of his mask meeting Shota's without hesitation. "Like I said, it makes sense. A quirkless person couldn't make it in heroics. It's better you put an end to it now rather than after they've been hurt." Ishiyama nodded in agreement. He turned his gaze to Nemuri, who still looked uncomfortable. However, it only took a raised eyebrow for her to break her silence, throwing her hands in the air dramatically. "What do you want me to say, Shota? I know you wouldn't expel someone without a good reason, and not having a quirk would put anyone at a disadvantage." "Correct, which is why I did not expel Midoriya." He gave them each a hard look to stop their outcries, lingering on Hisashi, who didn't seem to know exactly what was going on, but had a history of forgetting what office noise level was. Despite being at a disadvantage, he still got into the most prestigious heroic school in the country, placing second overall. He also placed 9th on my quirk assessment test, and from what I can gather, this was without any support since people don't tend to believe those without quirks can be heroes. At this point, even Inui had shifted his focus over to Shota from his paperwork. He asked me if he could be a hero, and I said yes. As you all know, I'm not one for giving out empty platitudes and supporting illogical dreams. But Midoriya has proven that he has an incredible amount of potential, so I would hope that you all would treat him with the respect you would grant any other student. With that out of the way, Shota turned back to his work and let the others mutter between themselves. He'd like to think that the other teachers would have given him that respect anyway, but remembering how resigned Midoriya had been had pushed him to act. After all, sadness came from many places, but resignation came from experience, and Shota was not about to let UA add to whatever problems the kid had faced. "So you didn't expel anyone today?" It was an obvious attempt to lighten the mood, Nemuri's outgoing persona in full swing with a teasing note to her voice. Feeling that the others had taken his words to heart, Shota rose to the bait, though he kept his focus on the schedules he was shuffling for the next few weeks. "No." The kid's incredulous face at being told he was in UA flashed across his mind, and he let out a scoff, choosing to focus on the humor of that moment rather than the heartbreak. Even if I had expelled him, the kid didn't even realize he was in UA's heroics course, so I doubt he would have cared much if I did. "What?" Shota whipped around to glare at Hisashi, hair floating and quirk activated, as the quirk-enhanced shout reverberated around the office. It didn't do much, though, as everyone else's shouts began to overlap and create an even bigger ruckus. "No, I agree with Yamada. What? How do you not realize something like that? What? Okay, that has got to be a lie." "Well, that is quite unexpected." The calm statement cut through the noise of the other teachers. Everyone's head swiveled around to meet the voice of Nezu, who had appeared at an unattended desk as if he had been sitting there the whole time. "And what were you expecting?" Shota couldn't hide the suspicion that laced the statement. The fact that the white-furred principal had been expecting anything set Shota on edge. Nezu was smart and good-natured, yes, but he also had a sadistic streak and a level of cunning that would scare anyone with half a brain and an understanding of plausible deniability. "I'm not sure. He had enough skill to be able to enter UA without the support of a quirk, so I admit he captured my curiosity. I put him in your class because that would be the quickest way to test if he had what it takes. He would either be kicked out immediately, or he would remain, and be in the class of the hero who would be able to help him the most when it comes to fighting quirkless. However, entering the school without realizing has several implications I did not account for. That caused an immediate rise of tension within the room, as the teachers were faced with the reality that a quirkless child had managed to do something that one of the smartest creatures alive had not taken into consideration, combined with the fact that they were still processing that the quirkless student had also entered UA without realizing. The staff room was left silent. "Aizawa, if you could come to my office, I would like to have a brief discussion on the student and where to go from here." The others maintained their silence as Shota stood up and followed Nezu's retreating back, unsure of where this conversation was going to go. It was common belief that Nezu had an office somewhere in the upper levels in the building, but the reality was that it was a place for impressing visitors and officials. Nezu's actual office was only a short walk away from the rest of the staff. It was less grand than the room in the upper floors, but it was filled with far more information, and a level of security that would put a high-security vault to shame. He watched the small mammal prepare some tea and set a pair of cups on his desk as he settled into a chair across from him. "Now, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to hear the whole encounter from the beginning." Shota took a sip of tea and began at the start of the day. He went over Midoriya's responses to each test and how he became almost unnoticeable when not completing them. In fact, he'd been silent the whole assessment, completely forgettable if not for the unexpected methods he used to raise his scores. Nezu was silent, listening intently, even as Shota reached his recounting of the afternoon. He kept it brief, knowing that while it was important to emphasize how badly Midoriya must have been treated in order to break down so completely out of basic encouragement, it was a personal moment that didn't need to be recounted in perfect detail. Nezu stapled his fingers together, as much as his paw-like hands would allow him to at least. "You said he didn't have any training, formal or otherwise?" "What he said was that he had absolutely no training or skills before I had to make him realize he was in the heroics course." He finished the last of his tea before leaning back in his seat. "Aside from making sure the teachers and other students treat him well, I'm not sure what we can do." "Indeed. It is a very unusual situation we have found ourselves in." Shota resisted the urge to groan. These sorts of problems usually emerged later in the year after the students had gotten some real-life experience and realized how dangerous and unglamorous being a hero really could be. Those students could be directed to Inui, as the dog-like hero was a specialist at heroics-related counseling, but without any knowledge on Midoriya's past and the full extent of his problems, there wasn't much they could do. Nezu seemed to share a similar opinion. "I believe our best option at the moment is to treat him like any other student, though I would like to meet him. Personal issues aside, he is still an incredibly intelligent individual, and I would hate to see that go to waste." That had Shota taking a long pause, hearing the underlying message in Nezu's statement. "You want to train him?" "Perhaps. I will hold off meeting him until he's more settled, as I doubt anyone would appreciate having a meeting with their principal so early in the school year." When Nezu added nothing else and began stacking their teacups, Shota took that as dismissal. He stood up, running through a mental checklist of what he had to get done for the next day, and whether or not he would be able to finish all that and fit in a nap before his patrol. He was almost out of the door when Nezu spoke up again, eyes gleaming with a light that Shota didn't trust. "Keep an eye on him, Aizawa. That boy is a variable hard to account for. He's already beaten so many odds. I have no idea what could happen next." He smiled with teeth too sharp for any rodent. "How interesting, and how terrifying that is." Humming to the tune that was playing on the radio, Inko finished cutting up the pork for tonight's dinner and moved to gather the ingredients to crumb them with. She'd been assigned a late shift on this week's roster, but there was no way she was going to miss being home for Izuku's first day of school. It had taken a bit of persuasion and manipulation to get one of her co-workers to switch hours with her for today, but it was worth it. Of course, that had meant she'd spent most of the day stress-cleaning the house from top to bottom, then pacing once there was nothing left to do with her hands. Eventually, she had settled on preparing dinner early, so she would be able to give Izuku her full attention once he came home. The radio was good background noise, but it couldn't keep her completely distracted from the pull of worry in her chest. He was on his way to being a hero, but he was still young, still quirkless, and Inko wasn't sure if he could handle it. She had been expecting to hear the phone ring at some point in the day, telling her to pick up her son because there had been a mistake. The door handle rattled, and Inko's eyes widened in horror as she realized exactly what she had just thought. She quickly washed her hands and banished that line of thinking from her mind once again, making her way to the front door that was now opening. She straightened her resolve. No matter what had happened today, she would support Izuku. She wasn't going to doubt him without cause, not after he'd worked so hard to get into UA. "Welcome home, Izuku. How was your day?" Her smile immediately started to fade upon seeing her son's face, his eyes clearly red from crying, even if other evidence had been wiped away. "Izuku, what's wrong? What happened?" She could feel her worry blossoming into panic, hands beginning to wave in front of her, when Izuku looked up at her and smiled. And all the breath left her body. His smile was all over the place, like someone had glued 3 different pots into one that only just held its shape, but it was real. When he replied with, "It was good," she didn't doubt for a second that he meant it, despite his tear-reddened eyes and raw voice. This wasn't a fake smile used to cover up something he wouldn't share, or a pale imitation of the joy he'd had when he was younger. But it wasn't that joy either. This was something new, something fragile and precious, and she finally had to face the fact that something had been wrong, and she'd missed it. So she couldn't help it when the tears rose in her own eyes, letting out a choked, "That's good," before hugging him tightly. Soon he was joining in, fresh tears trailing down his face, and she vowed to figure out what she had missed these past few years. The dawn light was just beginning to creep into his room as Izuku woke up, alarm blaring from his phone. He was almost surprised he'd woken to it at all. He couldn't remember falling asleep. The few hours he'd managed to get in had been dreamless, which was a relief from the thoughts that had been tearing through his mind the whole evening. But even as he groggily got changed into an old shirt and some shorts for his morning routine, he could feel those thoughts stirring again, realizing he was awake so the landscape of his mind was ready for a complete upheaval once again. He was only just able to keep his mind distracted on his morning jog, focusing on his surroundings and what he was doing. 3 blocks. He turned left, tried to keep watch for the cracked pavement, came up in a roll when he remembered a second too late and was sent tumbling. Don't think about it. 5 blocks. He made a sharp turn right into an alleyway. For a shortcut, using the dumpster as a jumping point, he grabbed the broken part of the fire escape, making a mental note to email the building manager again that their fire escape was still broken. The jump over the fence now complete, he sped up, running to the next street. Don't think about it. Slowing back to a jog, he kept taking deep breaths and noticed Aspen was running late for his 4 a.m. patrol again. Either that or he'd changed his patrol route recently. As if to prove him wrong, a second later the mottled green hero burst across the street, trailing a wake of leaves. He'd also said no. Don't think about it. Izuku completed the last leg of his morning route by climbing the chain-link fence that had once kept the kids from this neighborhood, himself included, out of the patch of woods. That was until Bakugo decided that they were going on an adventure. Now it held less mystery, less excitement, but had become even more important to Izuku as he used the forest to test his skills. Without access to proper equipment, he turned to the trees to use for climbing practice, not trusting himself with steep building walls to start off with. Even after he'd grown past that, he'd still kept coming here, enjoying the quiet, sprinting through the undergrowth to improve his speed, stamina, and observation. Missing even the tiniest root could lead to a mouthful of dirt and graze palms. Taking in the early morning birdsong, he stretched in the clearing that had become his home base, before unfurling his sling. There were targets, painted onto trees, their branches on boxes and cans he'd set up around the clearing, and a few hanging from the canopy. It was cobbled together and rough around the edges, but it was enough for Izuku. For an hour, all he did was work on his accuracy, and the power he put into each throw. He let himself get lost in the rhythm of it all, until it was time for him to head home. As he jogged home, he finally had to face the fact that things had changed. Usually he took this time to plan his day, what schoolwork he'd need to get done, and what he'd have to do to track down the next hero. But now there was nothing. There was no next hero. Sure, he had notes for the other pros that taught at UA, and the next few heroes on his alphabetical list, but Eraserhead had said yes. The thought was too much, too overwhelming, even after he'd run it through his mind over and over again the night before. He couldn't even distract himself with schoolwork because it had only been the first day. He was already familiar with all of UA's rules. No one had assigned work or given out more than broad topics, so there was no starting point he could use to begin his own studying. That had brought its own round of questioning, when he once again had to remind himself that he had gotten into UA. It felt like there'd been a mistake, on whose part he wasn't sure, but people didn't accidentally get into UA. Should he even be there if he hadn't realized he was getting in? There were so many more qualified people out there with such amazing quirks, so surely they deserved the spot more than he did. Izuku flinched in time to avoid running into a street lamp, unaware that he had been speeding up as his thoughts raced along with him. He couldn't deal with this, not all at once. So he did what he had done for a year. He chose a new goal and focused on it. Get ready for school wasn't much of a long-term goal, but he could feel his focus shifting to what he'd need for the day, instead of everything else that threatened to overwhelm him. It was only as he was changing into his uniform after showering that he could distract himself, skidding into the kitchen in front of a very startled Inko. He gestured wildly to himself, shirt only half buttoned up. "Mum, when did I get muscles?" Inko stared blankly at his mildly panicked tone before replying slowly. "Izuku, what are you talking about?" Izuku didn't know how to respond, deciding to just gesture again. "Were you not working out?" Inko's brows were slowly knitting up in confusion as he stood there. "Izuku, what were you doing?" I didn't realize." Too late, Izuku realized it might not have been a good idea to let his mom know that he hadn't been fully processing the past year, and that he himself had only just realized how little he had consciously processed. "I guess I was just really busy. I'm gonna keep getting ready for school, bye." Retreating into his room after that incredibly smooth exit, Izuku took a deep breath and began to gather his school books. As he sorted through stacks of notebooks to find the right ones and tried not to topple loose piles of paper when he reached for textbooks, he started to really see his room for the first time in months. It was still the same space, bed, shelves, wardrobe, desk, but it had changed. Where hero posters had once hung proudly on his walls, they had been replaced or covered by maps, article clippings, calendars, and planners. His small, neat collection of hero analysis for the future notebooks were somewhere in his straining shelves, but he couldn't be sure where, given the overwhelming amount of notebooks now filled with hero details that he'd used to track those he'd asked his question to. Even the splashes of color from his action figures and collectibles had disappeared, sold to fund his first aid supplies and bullet train tickets to other cities that his allowance wouldn't be able to cover. It didn't mean that much, right? It was worth losing all that merch. Sure, it was a collection he'd cultivated and prized for years and would never be able to replace, but he was on his way to being a hero now. As he packed his lunch and began to make his way to school, he told himself it would be worth it. He didn't think about all the heroes that had appeared in his merchandise, the way they'd spoken to him when they'd met in real life. He didn't think about how quickly he'd chosen to sell the All Might and Endeavor figures, their posters. He didn't think about how most of his collection had disappeared, without him even realizing. Standing in front of the door to 1A felt so different from yesterday. Izuku could feel his heart racing as he stared at the door, mind screaming that he was, indeed, in the heroics course, part of UA. He'd double-checked his acceptance letter after getting home, and there hadn't been a mistake, at least not one that had been noticed yet. He could hear the other students inside, and while it was comforting to know that they were in there, that this wasn't a dream or elaborate prank, that there were still other students who had powerful quirks, students like Bakugo. Izuku was in UA, and he was determined that no amount of bullying would be able to turn him away. He'd spent most of his life being bullied. He could handle a few more years if it meant he could be a hero. It was okay. It wasn't, but that had never changed things before. He was more successful slipping into the room today without Ida's aggressive greeting, though Uraraka did notice him and waved from where she was having a conversation with some of the other girls. Izuku attempted a shaky smile and wave in return, a warm feeling joining the buzzing of his nerves at the friendly interaction. Seeing her go back to her conversation, he made his way into his seat, staying low over his desk to make himself less noticeable. Now officially at school, sitting still, his mind didn't have anything else to distract itself with. Anxiety crawled like ants under his skin, as thoughts of middle school crept up on him, reminders of what to expect from the other students and the teachers. Aizawa encouraging him was amazing, and Uraraka was so nice, but those two were outliers if he was going on past experience. He was an analyst, after all, and he couldn't ignore years' worth of data. So caught up in old memories, his awareness failed him. When someone tapped his back, he couldn't help but flinch away. He turned slowly, hoping to make the movement look casual, because other students always looked for a reaction and he couldn't give them that, not if he wanted to be left alone for the most part. The purple-haired student, Shindo? He couldn't remember. He'd been trying to figure out how to talk to Aizawa before he expelled him regardless of the quirk assessment test results. Was still pulling his hand back, a sheepish look on his face when Izuku had turned to fully face him. Sorry for startling you. It's fine. Izuku twitched his shoulders in an approximation of a shrug. The other boy didn't seem entirely comfortable either, shifting a bit in his seat and tapping at the notebook out on his desk, which, luckily for Izuku, had Shinso Itoshi written on the top. After a few awkward seconds, Shinso sighed, running a hand through the mess of his hair. Listen, I just wanted to say thanks for helping me at the entrance exam. What? Something was wrong, Izuku's mind already analyzing the statement for any traps, for the joke that would follow. He didn't get thanked. He helped where he could, but it was usually his choice to get involved. People didn't thank him for butting in, especially when he barely did anything to help in the first place. Shinso didn't crack, though, didn't reveal the trick, just shrugged and kept talking. You gave me some advice on how to beat the robots and their physical weak points after taking out the two-pointer that had been chasing me down. I don't blame you if you don't remember. That whole exam was insane, but you're probably the only reason I passed, so thanks. With that, Shinso smiled tiredly at Izuku, and he realized that this was genuine. Oh, sure, I'm happy I could help. You probably could have passed regardless. He did his best to remember the entrance exam, people he'd met and tried to give advice to. He had the faintest recollection of someone with purple hair swinging a pole at a two-pointer, but he couldn't be sure that was Shinso. That person had been the only one who had really responded to his advice, and looking back on it, he probably should have encouraged the others more. I didn't even do much. I wish I could have helped more. The purple-haired boy huffed out a laugh. It's a competition. Why'd you even help people by doing that when you could have lost points? Izuku could have explained that he knew about the concept of rescue points, that it made sense that helping others could give him more points, but that wasn't the whole reason he'd chosen to do it. Even if rescue points had been a factor, he'd always been the kind of person to get in the way, to meddle even when he wasn't wanted. Looking back on it all now, with everything he'd avoided for so long in the forefront of his mind, he realized the reason why he'd done it. He was so used to not being enough, feeling like the odds had been stacked against him, and he didn't want anyone to feel that useless, awful, sinking feeling he'd lived with most of his life. So he did his best to help. He'd learned long ago that no one was going to help him, but it was fine. Stop thinking about it. I guess I know the feeling. I didn't want anyone to feel the same as I do. Shinzo just stared at him as he finished talking, causing Izuku to shrink in on himself. He didn't know why he said that. He did. He was trying to figure out too much, and some of it had slipped out. But an apology was already on the tip of his tongue, when Aizawa made his way through the door and got the class to quiet down. Homeroom was spent with Aizawa going over basic school rules, class setup, and letting everyone know that if there were any issues, personal or class-based, that they could be brought to him. He'd met Izuku's eyes in that moment, and he wasn't sure how to take that. After that, their real classes began, and worries about the past and future were replaced with class content, though those thoughts were still swirling at the back of his mind. They rose up when ectoplasm entered the classroom from mass, clamoring for attention, but Izuku forced himself to think about the work rather than the hero who told him he could never be one. It had been an uncomfortable lesson, but ectoplasm hadn't acknowledged him, and that suited Izuku well, preferring to go unnoticed in most cases. He felt the same discomfort when their history teacher was revealed to be Cementos, but the concrete hero didn't treat him any differently than the other students, which was a relief. When the lunch bell rang, Izuku was confronted with the fact that it was only halfway through the day. He was so tempted to reach out to the state he'd been in the past year, present but disconnected once more, but he wasn't sure how long it would take him to come back if he weren't there. He'd felt Shinso's eyes on him the whole day, never a good sign, and Bakugo's desk was right in front of his. The explosive teen looked more tense than usual, which was always a warning for Izuku to get away as fast as possible, or risk becoming an unwilling form of stress relief. Would UA stop him? Would they stop any of the students? After all, he was quirkless. They probably didn't even want him in the school. Hey, Midoriya, do you have any plans for lunch? He leaned back from where Uraraka had come to stand by his desk, hands planted on the surface minus her pinkies. He looked between her and Ida, who hovered behind her in a stiff plank of wood that had gained sentience kind of way. No. Come join me and Ida. A few seconds without a reply, and Ida joined in, hands waving. It would be quite nice to have more company, as it is imperative to foster good relationships while at school. It's also less daunting to do new activities with others, and this will be the first time we've all been to the cafeteria. Not seeing any trick in their earnest expressions, and wanting to put some distance between himself and Bakugo, Izuku nodded. He'd taken to avoiding the cafeteria in middle school, the crowded hall filled with harsh jabs, both physical and verbal, so it was disorienting to be back in such a similar environment. It made for a tense walk as the trio grabbed their food and found a place to sit. Uraraka kept glancing between the both of them, probably hoping for some sign of interaction, and seemingly finding none, decided to start the conversation herself. You know, I wasn't sure it would be true all of our teachers would be pro-heroes, since they're so busy with that, but they've all been really good so far. Before Izuku could process how the fact that their teachers were pro-heroes, some of which had told him he could never be one, made him feel, and how he was meant to respond to that statement, Ida replied. Of course, they would not allow someone with no experience in the world of heroics to teach at such an esteemed establishment. Practice and experience are two of the most important factors when working towards becoming a pro-hero. As Ida mentioned experience, the last pieces fell into place, and Izuku realized who the proper boy reminded him of. Oh yeah, you'd have first-hand information on that, wouldn't you? I'm sorry. Both he and Uraraka looked at Izuku quizzically, Ida with a more guarded expression. Backtracking, Izuku quickly went to explain himself. You're related to the Ida family, right? The one that runs the Ida 10 agency? Ida still didn't confirm or deny, so Izuku rushed on. It's been run by the same family since its foundation, which is a bit unusual since heroic agencies usually follow a more business-like approach of appointing heirs and non-hero managers to run the agency in the event of the leading hero's death. But Ida 10 has opted for a more traditional hereditary approach that mostly works since their agency is very teamwork-oriented with dozens of sidekicks. Their public image is pretty high because of it, ranking in the top 20 for most friendly agency and top 50 for corporation levels. Realizing he had begun to ramble rather than just explain himself, he hunched his shoulders, voice growing quieter as he trailed off his explanation. And they have the same last name as you, with a similar engine quirk, so I thought that you're probably related. Yes, I am. Ingenium is my older brother. Ida looked shocked, blinking repeatedly as he stared at Izuku. Uraraka once again came to rescue them from the awkward tension that was gathering. That's pretty cool, Ida. You kinda came across as a rich boy, but I wouldn't have been able to guess you were related to a hero. It was Ida's turn to look a bit sheepish, spluttering at rich boy. However, he didn't seem to be done with Izuku. How did you know all that information? I liked. Izuku wasn't sure anymore. He hadn't been sure for a while, but that was just one of the many things he had to figure out. Heroes, so I remember a lot about them. I wish I had that kind of memory. I'm pretty sure I only scraped by the written portion of the entrance exam. Uraraka sighed dramatically and slouched in her chair. I always have trouble studying, so Aizawa might end up expelling me anyways. That is unlikely, as long as you work hard to pass. I'm sure they would offer supplementary lessons for those who requested them. Now please, sit up properly. Good posture is incredibly important. As Ida ranted about good posture, and Uraraka gently teased him about it until they both realized their lunches were getting cold, Izuku thought that things might be changing. It was nice to be invited to sit with others, with no strings attached. He still felt tense, like his thoughts wanted to drag him into another breakdown. But sitting in the presence of Ida and Uraraka at his dream school, he thought that maybe he'd be able to survive the rest of the day. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 1. The second half to Chapter 1 will be up next. I hope you all are enjoying this fic so far. I really like it a lot. I think the whole series is really unique and cool, so getting to see a long fic version of a continuation to this one, I'm really excited to podfic this. So let me know your overall reactions to everything so far. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.